Hi, everybody. Tonight, we begin a slow descent into the heart of ancient sand and stone. A tale, not of golden glory, but of burdens buried beneath the mask of godhood. This story isn't about pyramids or sphinxes or curses that make Hollywood shiver. No, this is about the men who wore the crown, the pharaohs of Egypt. Supposedly gods on earth, they were worshipped, obeyed, and feared, but their lives were far from divine. In this 24-part journey, we will explore the full, raw, and quietly tragic experience of being a pharaoh. Each part will gently peel away the gilded image to reveal something far more human and often heartbreaking. Power, as we'll see, comes with a price, and the throne of Egypt was anything but a safe seat. So get comfortable, breathe slowly, and let your mind drift with the wind of the Nile back through time. We begin now with the first tale. He was born under a sky heavy with expectation. Not a wail, not a cry, not even a flutter of resistance. Just silence. The midwives held their breath as a fragile bundle was placed before the gods in human skin, his father and mother, the pharaoh and his queen. This child wasn't born to live a life. He was born to be Egypt. Before he could speak, priests were chosen for him. Before he could walk, astrologers read the stars to map the burdens he would bear. Before he knew what choice meant, it was decided he had none. He would rule. Not when he was ready, not when he asked, but when the old gods chose it was time. The first years passed like a mirage, soft and shimmering. His wet nurse hummed songs from the Delta, a melody she was not allowed to claim in front of the royal court. Behind the stone columns and gilded doors, affection was currency, rationed and bartered. The queen touched his forehead once a day, sometimes less. His father, the living Horus, glanced his way like one might glance at the horizon. Majestic, distant, untouchable. Every morning, the child was carried to a shaded courtyard surrounded by limestone walls. There, he learned to sit still, to listen to the viziers talk in tongues older than the pyramids, to absorb names of gods with crocodile jaws and sun discs, of sacred scrolls and laws carved into rock. Every afternoon, he was bathed in milk and frankincense. Each evening, he was read divine scripture, not lullabies. And then he was 5. At 5, he was old enough to begin learning the lie, that the pharaoh does not bleed, though he does, that the pharaoh does not age, though he will, that the pharaoh never falters, even as his knees buckle under the weight of every eye watching him. His tutors taught him arithmetic through grain rations, not play, geography through war maps, not rivers, language, not as poetry but as decree. He could summon a death sentence with the same voice he used to ask for water. By 10, the courtiers bowed to him, but they did not love him. That word love slid off the stone walls like water. No servant could truly feel it. No advisor could afford it. The gods demanded obedience, not affection. And so he grew, not as a boy, but as a symbol. When he stumbled, the world did not laugh with him. It stared, rigid, waiting, measuring. The tiny cracks of humanity were unacceptable in the vessel of Ra. And still, he was lonely. Not even the cats loved him freely. Even they were carefully chosen, pure-blooded temple felines, trained to curl near him like living decor. He named one silently in his heart, never aloud. Dust, he called her, because she reminded him of something that settled when everyone had gone. There were children, too, other sons and daughters of nobles brought to the palace to train in courtly arts. He watched them play outside the peristyle garden. He was not allowed. Running was not befitting of Horus. One day, he did run. It was a flash of rebellion, bare feet against sun-warmed stone, laughter like thunder inside his hollow chest. He made it 6 steps before a guard intercepted him. Not harshly, not cruelly, just with a calm, rehearsed grip. He was lifted, gently, returned to his throne-like seat in the study chamber. The punishment wasn't beatings, it was silence. A chamber where no one spoke to him for 6 days, not even dust. By 15, he was prepared. Ceremonies, galas, offerings. He performed them flawlessly. Like an actor in a divine theater, every gesture was the proper one. He learned to smile without joy, to cry without sound, to endure boredom so dense it felt like drowning in honey. The high priests whispered their approval. The court chroniclers began calling him the morning sun. But he could barely remember a sunrise where he felt awake. Then came the first death. His father, aged and weathered, had begun to fall asleep during royal meetings. His hands trembled as he held the crook and flail. The Embalmers Guild had begun preparations in secret long before the falcon god left his body. The day the priests announced Horus had returned to the sky, the boy was anointed as pharaoh. He was 17. The ceremony took place at dawn. A cold wind blew off the Nile as incense choked the horizon. The priests painted him in gold and coal. He stood alone on the steps of the temple. The crowd watched, not cheering, waiting. He raised his arms. The people bowed. Inside, he was still that child who once named a cat Dust, but no one would ever know again. From this moment on, he was no longer allowed to feel. That night, he did not sleep. Not because of grief, not because of the heavy weight of crowns or gods, but because for the first time he realized he had everything. And still, he was unbearably alone. The palace was quieter after his father's death, but not in mourning. It was the silence of anticipation, of preparation, of strategy unfolding behind curtains and veils. Every noble family in Memphis and Thebes whispered behind carved wooden screens, each hoping the new pharaoh, barely a man, might be pliable, bendable, shapeable. But they didn't know what the young pharaoh had learned in silence. He had watched for years how people moved around his father, not toward him, but around him. Like river currents bending around a stone, they smiled with their mouths, bowed with their backs, and betrayed with their eyes. He had memorized those eyes. He had learned to recognize flattery, envy, fear, and ambition. His father had never taught him that. His mother never had time. But the palace taught him. The way a forest teaches a fawn that wolves do not always growl before they strike. So when the Grand Vizier approached him with gentle condolences and a golden scroll detailing the coronation schedule, the pharaoh said nothing at first. He stared at the man's sandals. They were dusty, unworthy of the moment. "I want them burned," the pharaoh said softly. "My sandals?" the vizier asked, unsure. "The scroll, and your shoes." The vizier's eyes flickered, just a moment too long. Then he bowed. The sandals were burned. A new scroll was drafted. Power, the pharaoh discovered that morning, was not loud. It didn't require shouting. True power lived in silence and stillness, in short commands and unblinking stares. His father had performed divinity. He would embody it. But even as he stood tall beneath the banners of Horus, a part of him still wondered what it might be like to laugh again. Really laugh. Not the rehearsed chuckles and feasts, not the shallow amusement at dancers or clowns, but a laugh that made his ribs ache and his eyes water. That longing returned when he met her. She was not a noble, not even a servant. She was a scribe's daughter, summoned by accident during a temple festival when the priest's usual scroll carrier fell ill. She entered the room like a shadow, head bowed, carrying a basket of reeds and ink. He noticed her because she didn't look at him. Everyone looked at him. Even when they pretended not to, they watched from the corner of their eyes. They always wanted something, a gesture, a smile, a sign of favor. She wanted nothing. That night he asked who she was. The answer came with 3 warnings. She was poor. She was untrained in court manners. She was unsuitable in every conceivable way. And yet he requested her return, not for pleasure nor scandal, simply to speak. In the gardens, away from the pillars and eyes and incense, in the cold evening air that smelled of date palms and dust, she asked him strange questions. "Do you ever dream of being someone else?" He did not answer. "Do you ever forget your own name?" she asked another time. He nodded, just once. They never touched, not once. But the ache of wanting to was deeper than any flesh could reach. By the 4th meeting, he knew what must come next. But the court did not forget her presence. Whispers reached the Queen Mother, who summoned him with eyes like knives. She reminded him that pharaohs married only within noble bloodlines, that alliances were sacred, that deviation was weakness. He said nothing, but the girl never came again. He did not ask where she went. Some truths would only hurt more when spoken aloud, but he kept one of her reed pens, hidden beneath the sandstone brick behind his sleeping chamber. The coronation was vast, endless. Thousands watched as he was draped in the white and red crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. They cheered as he raised the crook and flail. They gasped as he mouthed the prayers that no one had taught him, but he somehow knew. The priests poured oil over his feet. The Queen Mother wept performatively. The viziers bowed so low their noses brushed stone. All the while, the new pharaoh felt nothing, only the weight of that pen in his mind. and the unspoken wish that it had all turned out differently. His first decree as Pharaoh was simple. All temples will keep 2 hours of silence every week. The priests were confused, the court puzzled, but none challenged him, and so it was. In that silence, he walked the hallways alone. He breathed without having to speak. He listened to the wind carve new secrets into the walls. He imagined the girl's voice in the stillness, the strange way she once spoke, like someone who had seen dreams the gods had not permitted. But peace is not a luxury pharaohs are allowed to hold for long. Soon came the disputes from the north. Tribes from Canaan had begun testing the outer villages, raiding grain convoys, vanishing into night before the guards could strike back. Trade routes strained. Local governors sent increasingly desperate messages, sealed in wax, begging for reinforcements, gold, guidance. He summoned his generals. They surrounded him in bronze and linen, maps spread wide before them. They spoke of spears and chariots, of terrain and blood. But he noticed none of them spoke of people. "Will you burn their homes?" he asked the lead commander. "If needed," the man replied. "Will their children remember your name?" "I hope they remember it with fear." The pharaoh said nothing, just stared at the map. "Let them remember nothing," he said at last. "Let there be no stories left to tell." The general bowed. That night, the pharaoh stood atop his palace's northern tower. He watched the stars shift, indifferent as always. Somewhere beneath them, people were dying, others plotting, some loving. He imagined the scribe's daughter again, and for the first time in his reign, he wept. Quietly, without witnesses. Just a boy in a crown, crying for the life he never chose, for the love he never held, for the silence that would now follow him forever. The war was not grand. There were no sweeping charges, no triumphant returns. It was a quiet war, one that crept along the edges of Egypt like a whisper, slow and suffocating. The skirmishes bled into months, then years. The pharaoh sent his best men, his swiftest horses, his sharpest bronze. The messages returned slower each time, their tone darker, briefer. But what troubled him more than the war was the way the palace changed while his eyes were fixed on maps. The queen mother grew more present in council. The vizier's sleeves became longer, his voice smoother. The priest spoke of omens, snakes born with 2 heads, a blood-colored moon. A falcon seen flying backward over the temple of Ra. He knew omens well. He had been one once. Each morning, he awoke to offerings laid at his chamber threshold. Not simple ones, no. These were extravagant. Sculptures, lapis lazuli boxes, rare spices from Punt. But he didn't ask for them, didn't want them. They reeked of desperation, of people trying to bind him with gold. He ordered them removed. Not just once, but every time they reappeared. "I am not a god," he said. The courtiers stared in horror. "But you are," one whispered, as if frightened that the walls themselves might punish such doubt. "No," he said again. "I'm a man, just a man who reads, who aches, who remembers." That word, remembers. He could not forget her. The way she had looked at the sky instead of him. The way she asked questions no one else dared to voice. Her absence was a wound that never closed, only scabbed over in gold. He often wandered to the northern gardens, where she had once spoken of dreams. He had the trees trimmed to match the shapes she once traced in the air with her fingers. He had a bench carved from the stone she once sat on. And there in the evening light, he sometimes wrote. Not decrees, not doctrines, but letters. Letters he never sent, never signed, never sealed. "I wonder if you were real," one read, "or just the last human thing I'll ever touch." The war continued. Victories came, but with them came costs. The treasury shrank. The soldiers returned with new faces, young, eager, and scared. They called him Pharaoh with trembling voices, unsure if they were praising a man or invoking a storm. One soldier, no more than 16, was brought before him to receive a medal. The boy's hands shook as he bowed. "What is your name?" the Pharaoh asked. "Apu," the boy stammered. "Do you know what this medal is for?" Apu nodded. "For saving the banner when it fell." "And how did it fall?" Apu looked down. "The bearer was cut in half. I caught it before it touched the ground." The Pharaoh stared at him. "Do you want this medal?" The boy hesitated, then shook his head. "No, my king." And so the Pharaoh placed it on the marble beside him. "Then leave it here. Go home. Find something real to carry." Apu never returned to the army. This act did not go unnoticed. The Queen Mother summoned him again. Her hair now white, her voice edged with steel. You shame the throne, she hissed. You let boys walk away from duty. You question the divine order. You confuse the people. They are already confused, he replied softly. They bow to me and hope I'll save them from things they do not name. You are the savior. No, he said, I'm the mask they put over their fear. He stood and walked to the window, where the horizon cracked open with sunlight. I do not want to be a god. She stood behind him in silence for a long time. Then, in a voice half sorrow, half threat, she said, Then they will unmake you. That night, the Pharaoh wrote again. This time, not to her, but to himself. If I had been born a farmer, he wrote, would I still feel this ache? If I had been a scribe's son, would I have learned to be small and known peace? If I had never worn a crown, would I still be watched when I closed my eyes? Sleep eluded him. Even the silence he once found comfort in now seemed oppressive. Every breath echoed. Every breeze through the limestone corridors sounded like footsteps he could not place. He ordered the palace cleared. No servants in his wing, no guards inside his doors. Just emptiness. But solitude is a dangerous mirror. Without voices to drown his own thoughts, he began to hear them more clearly. A whisper of doubt, old and persistent. A god should not doubt. A god should not grieve. A god should not long for things he cannot name. One night, he wandered into the Hall of Records, rows upon rows of scrolls dating back generations. There, beneath a layer of dust, he found the annals of his grandfather's reign. They spoke of glory, but also of drought, riots, and illness. The official scrolls never mentioned these, but the personal scrolls, sealed, hidden, told the truth. His grandfather had wept too. He had written letters he never sent. He had cursed the gods for giving him power and then demanding he pretend it never hurt. The Pharaoh read every word by oil lamp until dawn touched the sky and his hands were black with soot. In those fragile, brittle scrolls, he found something he hadn't felt in years. Not joy, but kinship. And for the first time, the Pharaoh wondered if all kings were just men in cages, taught to worship their own shackles. The months that followed felt like drifting sand, fine, slow, quiet, and suffocating. From the outside, Egypt gleamed. The temples continued their rituals. The high priests burned incense. The nobles feasted. The statues of the Pharaoh, his face carved in eternal stillness, were erected beside those of his ancestors. But behind the cool limestone and beneath the layers of gold, something was fraying. The Pharaoh stopped speaking during meetings. He listened, always, watched, observed how courtiers circled around problems without naming them, how generals sharpened their words but dulled their truths, how priests carefully avoided his eyes when discussing the divine. They feared him more now, not out of reverence, but uncertainty. What frightened them was not anger, it was quiet, because power that doesn't shout is harder to predict. And he had become very quiet. He began rising before dawn, long before the bells rang from temple towers. He would walk barefoot through the eastern gardens, the dew cold on his skin, the horizon still gray with sleep. No guards followed him. No ministers dared interrupt. These mornings became his rituals. He would whisper to the papyrus leaves, trace shapes in the dust with his toe, speak names no one remembered. Sometimes he stood before the Nile and tried to forget his name, just for a breath. Just long enough to imagine he wasn't Pharaoh, but a fisherman's son, watching the water carry dreams away. But the Nile always returned reflections, and the man staring back wore a crown even in silence. Soon whispers grew louder. The high priest of Ptah requested an audience. The man was ancient, older than most remembered, with a voice like wind slipping through crypts. When he entered the Pharaoh's chamber, he did not bow. He simply waited. You don't believe anymore, the priest said. The Pharaoh didn't answer. You no longer offer blood at the solstice. You delay the festivals. You question omens. I question nothing, the Pharaoh said. I simply wait for meaning. The priest narrowed his eyes. Meaning is made, not given. The Pharaoh looked toward the carved window, where light poured through in narrow beams. Or perhaps it's lost, and we only pretend to see it. The priest said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, blasphemy wears fine robes these days. The Pharaoh turned to him, calm. Then you may strip me of them. The old man did not. He left with slow, echoing steps, like the end of a procession no one clapped for. That evening, the Queen Mother returned to the royal court after months in Thebes. Her presence sent a chill through the palace, even in the desert heat. She arrived draped in purple linen, surrounded by her own entourage, women who spoke only in riddles and men who smiled too often. She approached the throne, bowed perfunctorily, and spoke softly. "You need an heir." The court fell silent. The pharaoh met her gaze. "Is Egypt so fragile now that it needs a child to save it?" "It always has," she replied. "You were once that child, a promise, a symbol." He said nothing. "There are daughters of noble blood, trained since birth. They are ready." The pharaoh stood, not angrily, but slowly, deliberately. "I do not want a womb. I want a voice." "You forget yourself," she said sharply. "No," he replied. "I remember everything, too clearly." She left without another word. But arrangements were already in motion. Within a fortnight, 3 noblewomen arrived at the palace, each chosen for their lineage, their beauty, their silence. They were paraded like offerings, veiled and adorned. The court watched as if witnessing a sacred rite, though no one seemed to smile. The pharaoh met each one, spoke gently, asked no cruel questions. He offered them fruit, not judgment, but he saw it in their eyes. They had been taught obedience, not curiosity. They had been trained to reflect glory, not to question it. That night, he returned to the Hall of Records. He pulled out a forgotten scroll, one written by a king 3 dynasties ago. It began with triumph, boasting of cities conquered and temples built. But the final lines, written in a smaller, tighter hand, said this: "No statue remembers my laughter. No priest recalls my favorite color. I will live in limestone, but not in memory." The pharaoh closed his eyes, and for the first time he asked himself, not as king but as man, what would remain of him when the sun set for the last time? Not his image. That would be shaped and reshaped by those who survived him. Not his temples. They would crack and crumble. Not his laws. They would be rewritten. What would remain? A pen hidden in a stone wall. A bench carved in memory of a girl who asked him who he truly was. And a silence he had carved for himself, where gods could not reach. In the days that followed, he withdrew from public ceremony. The court panicked, but he ignored them. He wandered instead to the tombs being carved for him, vast chambers deep in the earth, lined with images of gods holding ankhs and scales. He stood before them and felt no comfort. He spoke to the artisans. "Remove my image from the walls," he said. They hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. "I do not wish to be worshipped. I want to be forgotten." Still, they waited. "Do it," he said. And so they began. One by one, the chisel strokes chipped away the face of the God King. Dust rose like smoke, and the pharaoh felt something he had not felt in years: relief. The artisans worked slowly, not out of defiance, but out of caution. To erase a pharaoh's face from his tomb was no simple act. It was to unthread the tapestry of eternity, to undo a bond made not just with stone, but with the gods themselves. But still, they obeyed. Their hammers echoed through the rock like distant thunder. One by one, the chisels softened the once sharp features of the divine mask. The lips lost their form. The eyes dulled. The crown collapsed into dust. The pharaoh watched each stroke in silence. Sometimes he sat in the shadow of a torch, arms folded, just watching. Other times he knelt beside the stone carvers, his fingers tracing the cold, flaking remnants of what had once been his immortal self. There was no sorrow in his face, just a strange calm, the kind found in endings too long delayed. And then one morning, he stopped visiting the tombs. No one knew why. No decree was issued. No guards were told. He simply stopped. Instead, he wandered through the older parts of the palace, the forgotten corridors, the ones that led nowhere. Hallways built for earlier dynasties, filled with statues that no longer bore names, columns that had cracked from the weight of too many summers. There, he found something unexpected: a door. Small, wooden, half hidden behind a collapsed tapestry. It creaked when opened, revealing a staircase so narrow his shoulders brushed the walls as he descended. Cobwebs clung to his arms. The air smelled of earth and ink. At the bottom was a room no larger than a fisherman's hut. It was lined wall to wall with scrolls, each one older than the last. Some were unreadable, papyrus worn to thread, ink faded to shadows. Others were bound carefully, preserved in clay tubes, sealed with wax that bore no seal he recognized. In the center of the room was a desk, simple, cedarwood, stained with age, and on it a single scroll lay open. It was not written in court script, not the flowing, practiced hand of temple scribes, but a rougher script, still elegant, but raw. I was Pharaoh once, it began. He sat slowly and read. The scroll was a confession. It spoke of a ruler who had loved someone forbidden, a man, a soldier, someone who had died in a war the pharaoh himself had ordered. The writer spoke of nights alone, of guilt that burned hotter than the desert sun, of prayers said into empty air, of a life spent pretending to rule, pretending to believe, pretending to live. It ended simply. I asked the gods for silence. They gave me echoes. The pharaoh exhaled, a long breath, deep and trembling. He folded the scroll, placed it back on the desk, and sat in the quiet for a long time. When he emerged, he carried nothing with him, not even his crown. That day, he changed the court schedule. All audiences were canceled, feasts postponed, festivals delayed. Instead, he called for the children, not the princes or noble sons, but the children of scribes, bakers, guards, servants. Dozens were brought into the palace courtyard, confused, barefoot, some holding each other's hands. They were not told why. Their parents stood at the edge, whispering fears of punishment or curses or divine tests. The pharaoh walked among them unadorned, wearing plain linen. He knelt to speak to them. "What do you dream of?" he asked a boy with dust on his cheeks. The boy looked confused, then whispered, "Flying." He nodded. He asked the girl, "What do you fear?" She didn't answer at first. Then that my mother will leave and not come back. He looked away. Then he asked them all, "Do you know who I am?" Some nodded, others shrugged. "I'm the one everyone listens to," he said gently. "But today I want to listen to you." And so he did. For hours under the shaded palms, the children told stories of stolen bread, of whispered ghosts, of animals they'd never seen but imagined in great detail. They laughed, they cried, and he listened, really listened, for the first time in his life. That night he returned to his chambers and ordered all statues of him removed from the temple entrances. Not destroyed, just moved, hidden, buried, forgotten. In their place he requested simple stone benches, for resting, he said, for sitting in the shade. The high priests were appalled, the queen mother furious. But he had stopped caring what fury looked like. He began walking the streets in secret, hooded, silent. He bought figs with coins, not titles. He watched old men play senate on cracked boards. He listened to women singing lullabies as they washed linens by the river. One night he sat beside a blind storyteller in the square. The man asked, "You're quiet, why?" "I'm listening," the pharaoh said. "To what?" "To life." The old man nodded, as if that was the only answer worth hearing. And the pharaoh smiled. It wasn't the practiced, serene smile carved on his statues. It was crooked, small, honest. In that moment he felt more immortal than he ever had in any temple. A new rhythm took hold of the palace, slower, quieter, almost uncertain. The guards, once stiff and ever watchful, now loosened slightly when the pharaoh passed. Servants no longer bowed with panic, but with quiet curiosity. The court, however, grew restless. Whispers echoed in the alabaster corridors. He no longer attends offerings. He speaks to children, not nobles. He eats alone, like a commoner. He smiles too easily. To the old elite, the changes were dangerous. Not because he had become cruel, but because he had become reachable. And nothing was more unsettling to a court built on distance than a god who knelt. One evening, the queen mother called for a private supper. It had been years since they had shared a meal without scribes, guards, or political urgency. The chamber was lit by oil lamps, casting long dancing shadows across the painted walls. The food was delicate, honeyed duck, dates soaked in wine, warm barley bread. But the air was tense. "You are changing the bones of the kingdom," she said softly, slicing a fig. "I'm freeing it from pretending," he answered. "And what will rise in its place? Chaos? Kindness?" Her eyes gleamed under the lamplight. "Kindness doesn't build empires." He looked down at his cup, swirled the wine. "Then perhaps empires were never worth building." She set her fig down carefully. "You speak like a man ready to die." "No," he said, voice calm. "I speak like a man who no longer wants to live as someone else's echo." She studied him for a long time. Then, almost gently, "What did they do to you?" He paused, a soft breath. "Then, they crowned me before I learned how to choose." Outside, a desert wind moaned softly through the palms. Inside, the silence settled like dust on old stone. That night, he returned again to the room of scrolls beneath the palace. He carried no torch this time, only memory. His hands moved over the shelves like one might brush the backs of sleeping animals, carefully, reverently. There, in the far corner, he found a locked clay vessel, The wax seal had crumbled, but the weight of time still clung to it. He opened it slowly. Inside were records of judgments, not royal edicts, but personal pleas. Letters sent from farmers, midwives, boatmen, requests that had never reached the throne. One scroll, stained and barely legible, read, "My son was taken for the war. He never returned. Please, I beg you, tell me if he died with honor." Another, "My fields were claimed by the priests. I have 4 daughters. We eat leaves now. Will the gods not see us too?" And another, "I saw the statue of the Pharaoh smile. I believed he loved us. I spoke to it every morning. Tell him, please, that I said thank you, even if he never heard me." He folded each with trembling hands and sat there until the stone floor grew cold beneath him. The next day he summoned the court. It had been months since he'd stood in the full weight of ceremony. The palace chamber was filled. Nobles in their finest linens, priests with powdered wigs, scribes holding quills in trembling fingers. Everyone expected something, an announcement, perhaps a treaty or a new consort. But the pharaoh wore no crown. He stepped onto the dais with bare feet, and then he spoke. "I have read your words," he began, his voice soft but steady. "Not the ones carved in stone, not the ones spoken in my presence, but the ones whispered when no one listens." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, unsure. He continued, "You believe I am a god, but gods do not read letters. Gods do not cry over dead sons. Gods do not walk among the dying and ask why." He looked across the sea of painted faces. "I am a man." Silence. A man who has been trapped inside a myth. A boy who was handed eternity before he could understand mourning. The queen mother stared ahead, unmoving. "I will no longer be pharaoh in name alone. If I am to rule, it will be as one who sees, who listens, who remembers." The high priest stepped forward, his voice shaking. "You challenge Mot, the balance. You risk unraveling what keeps the world whole." The pharaoh turned to him. "Then perhaps the world needs to learn how to breathe again." He walked down from the dais, not to exit, but to walk among them. The nobles parted, unsure if they should kneel, flee, or follow. He walked slowly, stopping at the edge of the chamber. There, he pointed to the wall. It bore the great mural of his coronation, a towering image of him surrounded by rays of divine sunlight, his arms wide, the people below kneeling in awe. "Paint over it," he said. "Replace it with something true." A court artist stepped forward, trembling. "What shall we paint, my king?" He paused, then said, "A man standing in the river, holding nothing, looking up." The artist bowed. That night, the pharaoh returned to the same square as before, dressed as no more than a traveler. The old blind storyteller was there again, weaving tales to a crowd of sleepy children and drifting merchants. The pharaoh sat beside him, cross-legged. "You again," the storyteller said with a smile. "I wanted to hear the end." "There is no end," the old man replied, tapping his cane gently against the stone. "Only more listening." And they sat together as the stars rose overhead and the stories became quieter, gentler, like the breath of the Nile itself. That was the first night the pharaoh slept without dreams. The days grew shorter. Autumn approached, though in Egypt the seasons wore subtler robes. The air cooled, the river ran slower, and the horizon took on the weary hue of old copper. In the palace, change lingered like incense, never spoken aloud, but thick in the air. The pharaoh, no longer wrapped in divine silence, had begun to hold assemblies in the garden rather than the throne room. Beneath the shade of sycamore trees, he sat not above but among the people, scribes, builders, soldiers, even fishermen from the delta. There were no titles spoken, only names. He asked them simple questions. What would make your life easier? What do you wish your children could see? What have you lost? Sometimes they answered, sometimes they wept. Sometimes they just stared, uncertain if it was truly safe to speak to the man who had once been called the morning sun. One morning, a potter was invited to speak. He was old, bent, and sun-darkened. His hands were cracked like the clay he shaped. "I have no complaints, my lord," he said. "You must have something," the pharaoh said gently. The potter looked at the trees. "I dream of making a bowl," he said, "so perfect that no one dares to use it." The court scribe seated nearby scoffed lightly, but the pharaoh only nodded. "I understand," he said. "I once dreamed of being loved without worship." That silenced the garden. The potter bowed, and the pharaoh rose to pour him water with his own hands. It was not theater. It was not policy. It was a man learning how to be human in a kingdom built to deny him that very right. But as word spread through Egypt of the changes in the capital, not all ears received it with gratitude. In the far south, near the borderlands of Nubia, the temple of Amun sent a formal letter to the court. It was heavy with veiled rebuke. It warned of imbalance, of confusion among the people, of the gods withdrawing favor from a ruler who no longer upheld the divine hierarchy. The letter was signed in thick red ink, a quiet echo of blood. The pharaoh read it beneath an olive tree, flanked by silence. He traced the letters slowly, as though they might vanish if stared at too long. He did not reply. Instead, he traveled south, not as a king, not as a god, but as a man in plain linen, riding a modest boat down the Nile. It took days. The river wound like a serpent, its currents lazy and reluctant. Each village they passed greeted him in hushed awe. Children pointed. Elders offered dates and bread. No one knew what to say to a god who no longer wore gold. When they reached the temple of Amun, it was dusk. The priests had not expected him. They gathered in confusion, some in ceremonial dress, others still in evening prayer, a few with pigment on their fingers from painting murals. They stared at the figure approaching with no guards, no procession, no divine symbols. He stepped into the temple's inner sanctum, where incense hung thick and the scent of lotus petals clung to every breath. The high priest, a man called Menhotep, finally spoke. "You come unannounced." "I come unguarded," the pharaoh replied. "That is unwise." "No," he said, "it is unheard of. There's a difference." The priest narrowed his eyes. "You mock our traditions." "I am one of your traditions," he said calmly. "I was made to be. And now you would unmake yourself." The pharaoh walked slowly to the base of the great statue of Amun, towering, unreadable, its eyes blind and all-seeing. He gazed at it for a long time, then said, "When was the last time you heard it speak?" A murmur rippled through the chamber. The priest's voice sharpened. "The gods speak in symbols, in sun, in flood, in fire." "No," the pharaoh interrupted. "You speak in symbols. The gods, if they speak, speak in silence." The room tensed like a bowstring. "I am not your enemy," he continued, "but I am done performing divinity. If that breaks your order, perhaps your order needs breaking." The priest took a step forward. "You dare enter the Holy of Holies and cast off your godhood?" "I am not casting off anything," the pharaoh said. "I'm returning it. You may keep it." And then, before the stunned silence could twist into outrage, he turned and left. Back on the river, he stared at the stars reflected in the black water. They shimmered, fractured, never still, just like him, just like memory. He thought of his mother, how she used to tell him the stars were the souls of pharaohs past, forever watching. He wondered if any of them had ever tried to leave their thrones behind. If they had, no one wrote their stories. The journey back was quiet. The oars dipped rhythmically. No one spoke. Even the breeze seemed gentler, as though respecting something not yet named. When he returned to the palace, he ordered the temple scribes to rewrite the royal genealogy, not to remove his name, but to leave a blank space beside it. "What shall we write in the space?" one asked. "Nothing," he said. "Leave it empty. Let them wonder." The scribe frowned. "What will they call you then?" He paused, then said, "Let them call me Pause." The man hesitated, then nodded. And so in the scrolls of eternity, the line that once read Horus, light of the two lands, son of the sun, now bore a quiet emptiness, just a pause. And in that pause, something sacred began to breathe. The winter flood came early that year. The Nile rose not with violence, but with a strange serenity, its waters swelling gently, generously, submerging the banks and feeding the thirsty soil like a mother cradling her child. The people rejoiced. Fields were nourished. Fish were plentiful. The gods, some whispered, had forgiven the pharaoh. But those closest to the palace knew better. It was not forgiveness. It was indifference. And perhaps for the first time in generations, the pharaoh welcomed it. He stood often now on the high terrace of the eastern wing, overlooking the river. No ceremony, no guards, just him and the wind. Some mornings he stayed there for hours, unmoving, like one of the great statues, except his eyes moved, slowly, restlessly, as if searching for something the water might carry back. He had stopped wearing his sandals. His feet, once perfumed and wrapped in silks, now bore the dust of stone. His hands, once soft from oils and incense, had calluses from holding scrolls, plucking reeds, lifting small children onto his shoulders in the garden. The court called it madness. The priests called it heresy. But the people began to call him She Remembers, not because he reminded them of a goddess, but because when he spoke, it felt as if he remembered what they themselves had forgotten, that a ruler could see, could hear, could bleed. And in that quiet remembering, something shifted. A young servant named Theneth, barely 12, had once spilled a bowl of wine across the pharaoh's feet. In the old days, he would have been beaten, exiled, or worse, but the pharaoh only smiled, knelt, and helped him clean it. That boy grew up to be one of the kingdom's most loyal engineers. Another time, a midwife requested audience, not with gifts, not with formal plea, but with trembling hands. She had delivered a child with a twisted foot and feared the child would be taken away by priests, labeled cursed. She asked, not for pardon, but for mercy. The pharaoh granted it. He named the child Asatem, meaning carried by the sky. The midwife wept into his robe. But even as such stories bloomed among the people like lotuses after the flood, the deeper roots of power grew restless. 3 noble houses, old, bitter, and nearly forgotten, had begun convening in secret. House Sahur, House Enima, and House Jet. They had long suffered the slow erasure of their relevance. The pharaoh's reforms, though never named as such, had choked their influence. Their tax havens had crumbled. Their titles had been made symbolic. Their access to the royal audience reduced to formalities. So they whispered. They drew lines on old maps. They spoke of ancient laws, dusty oaths, and bloodlines traced in brittle parchment. And in the quiet hours before dawn, they sent for assassins, not to kill the pharaoh, but to test him. The first was a small attempt, a viper left beneath his bed cushion, a common desert snake, coiled and quiet. It was the pharaoh himself who found it. He did not cry out. Instead, he lit a small oil lamp, placed the bowl beside the snake, and waited until it slithered into the light. Then, with a bronze bowl, he captured it. Later that morning, he released it into the marshes near the Nile. The court was horrified when they found out. He only said, "It was hungry. It does not know ambition." The second was more brazen. A cup of wine offered during a public council, laced with powdered lead. The taster died within an hour. The pharaoh mourned him in silence, buried him in the royal tombs, and declared 7 days without alcohol in his honor. Again, no outrage, no vengeance, only silence. It was this quiet that unnerved the noble houses most. They expected fury, retaliation, purges, but the pharaoh offered only calm. Until one evening, he called for the leaders of all 3 houses. They arrived dressed in silk and suspicion. Each bowed deeply, each smiled. He invited them not to the court, but to the garden. They walked among the date palms, where lanterns flickered gently and frogs sang in the pools. He said nothing at first, then asked, "Do you believe I am still pharaoh?" They exchanged glances. House Sahur spoke first. "You are the heart of Egypt." House Enema followed. The eye of the gods. House Jet finished. The stone that holds the flood. He turned to them, expression unreadable. "No," he said. "I am the silence that remains when titles fade." They did not understand. He gestured to the trees. "I could have you buried beneath these roots, quietly, without trial. No names, no tombs, and no one would cry." The wind stilled, "But I will not." They waited, breathless. "I will not, because I want you to watch." He stepped closer. Watch a world where power does not need fear, where voices are heard without permission, where your names will be remembered not for plots, but for the moment you chose to kneel before justice, not after it. Then more softly, "Or you may leave tonight, return to your homes, and live out your days forgotten as dust in the corners of a new Egypt." He turned and left them in the garden. No guards escorted them. No scribes recorded the moment. But by morning, all 3 noble houses had left the capital. Some say they returned to their ancestral lands. Others believe they vanished into the desert. But their names were never spoken in the court again. And that silence was a monument. The palace grew quieter still, not with emptiness, but with clarity. The noise of ambition, the subtle jostling for titles, the soft conspiracies hidden in laughter, had faded. What remained was something purer, if unfamiliar. The stone corridors echoed not with footsteps of fear, but with the light tread of purpose. Each day began not with trumpet or gong, but with birdsong and breeze. The pharaoh had ordered the horns silenced, the drum stored. Instead, he walked the palace at dawn, barefoot, unguarded, often alone, sometimes with the young scribe Theneth, who now carried his ink and reed pens like a shadow of learning. The scribe, though still a boy, had become a mirror. He rarely asked questions, but when he did, they were sharp and sudden. One morning, as they watched the gardeners trim the reeds near the reflecting pool, Thenef looked up and asked, "Do you miss being feared?" The Pharaoh didn't answer right away. He lifted a reed from the water, twisted it between his fingers. "I never knew what it felt like to not be feared," he said. "So I don't know if I miss it or if I'm just learning how to breathe without it." The Neph nodded, and they watched the gardeners for a long while in silence. That same week, something strange happened. A woman arrived at the palace gates, dressed in red linen, with a child in her arms. She refused to give her name. She spoke calmly, her voice steady but dry, like one who had rehearsed every word she intended to say. "I want to speak to the man," she said to the guards. "Which man?" they asked. "The one who no longer believes he is a god." Word reached the Pharaoh quickly. He ordered her brought in. She entered the palace courtyard at sunset, light painting her skin in warm amber. She was not young, not old. Her eyes were lined from sun and sorrow. The child clung to her side, not crying, not curious, just watching. They sat beneath the sycamores, the three of them. The woman wasted no time. "My husband died building your grandfather's tomb." The Pharaoh nodded slowly. "He was promised bread and gold. He received neither." Again, he nodded. "We begged the priests. We were ignored. I raised this boy alone. He has never known a day without hunger." The Pharaoh looked at the child. "What is his name?" he asked. The woman's voice trembled for the first time. "Horotep." The boy looked down at his bare feet. The Pharaoh reached into the folds of his robe, pulled free a small bundle of parchment, his journal, never shown to anyone. He tore a blank page from the end, handed it to Thenef. "Write this," he said, and he spoke. "By order of the crown, Horotep, son of the builder lost to the tombs of Pharaoh Amenech, shall be granted full citizenship, grain allotments, and land upon the eastern fields of Memphis, free of tax for 10 years. His mother shall be named keeper of the red sycamore and hold place of honor in the harvest feasts." Thenef wrote quickly, barely keeping pace. When the boy looked up, something shifted in his face. Not joy, not relief, but the soft, cautious light of being seen. As they rose to leave, the woman bowed low, not in submission, but in quiet thanks. And as they walked away, the Pharaoh closed his eyes. He could still hear her footsteps after they had gone. That evening, he summoned the royal treasurer, a thin, anxious man who smelled of papyrus dust and rose oil. "Bring me the list," the Pharaoh said. "Which list, my lord? The one we hide." The man paled. "I want the names of every family owed by this palace, every broken promise, every unpaid debt, every stolen field, every taken child, everything we pretended not to see." The treasurer hesitated, then, seeing no escape, bowed and left. 3 nights later, the scrolls arrived. There were too many. Too many names, too many wrongs, stacked in bundles taller than Thenef. Centuries of neglect disguised as divine order. The Pharaoh did not sleep. He read by torchlight, one scroll at a time. He paused only to sip water, to breathe, to place his hand on his chest when the shame became a weight. At dawn, he called for the temple scribes and issued a new decree. Not for statues, not for glory, but for memory. A new library would be built, the house of the unspoken. Inside it, the names of every commoner wronged by the court would be recorded, every injustice acknowledged, every voice given ink. "It will not undo the past," he told the scribes, "but it will remember it." "Why remember shame?" one dared to ask. "Because forgetting it made us gods," the Pharaoh replied, "and I am done with gods." Word spread like fire wrapped in silk, soft but unstoppable. Peasants arrived to speak their names. Elders came to whisper the names of their parents and their parents before them. Children recited stories they had been told in hushed voices after supper, about taxes unpaid and guards too cruel, about land lost to floods no one ever helped them rebuild from. And the library filled. Each name a stitch in a new kind of eternity, not carved in stone, but written in human ink. And still the Pharaoh walked the palace barefoot, quiet, a man not trying to be remembered as perfect, but simply remembered as real. That winter, the people began calling him something else. Not God, not "she remembers," the one who returned peace. And he, for the first time, accepted the name without correction. The rains came late that year, not from the sky above the Nile, but from the south, great black clouds that rolled in with a kind of silent thunder, shadowing the temples of Thebes and casting long fingers of gloom across the river. Farmers looked up nervously. Birds flew lower. The wind carried the scent of distant storms and something older, something ancient. It had been decades since the last great sickness passed through the land. The pharaoh remembered it dimly, as a child, hiding behind a silk curtain as men were carried through the palace gates, wrapped in linen before they were even cold. He remembered the muffled wailing, the priests smearing ochre over doorways, the endless smell of bitter herbs boiled in desperation. Now it returned, but different. It began quietly. 3 children in the village of Persobek fell ill, their skin flushed, their breath ragged. Within days, their mothers joined them. Then a merchant's wife, then his apprentice. By the end of the week, no market stalls opened, and the temple bells rang for mourning, not prayer. The high priest sent word to the pharaoh with sealed scrolls. Their language was cautious, polite, but the fear inside them bled through. "The gods are testing us again," one line read. The pharaoh did not summon generals. He did not order statues. He summoned healers. From every province, every district, every temple, not just those certified by the court, but women known in small villages, old men who carried satchels of dried roots, midwives whose fingers knew fever better than scrolls ever could. They came in silence, some skeptical, some trembling, many simply weary. He greeted each one personally. To one he said, "Teach me how to bind the throat when breath is shallow." To another, "Show me the plant that calms the blood." They looked at him strangely, but they taught him, and he learned. In the great hall, he set aside an entire wing for the care of the sick. The marble floors were washed with vinegar, the windows opened wide. Musicians were dismissed. Priests were asked to pray outside where the air could move. He tended to the ill himself. He did not wear gloves. He did not wear a crown. Only linen, simple and white. He sat beside the dying, listened to their final words, held their hands when families could not. He sang once for a boy whose mother was too weak to do it herself. A lullaby no one recognized. One he had heard in the North Gardens long ago, sung by the scribe's daughter. He sang softly until the boy closed his eyes and never opened them again. By the end of the second week, he had not slept more than an hour a night. His hands were blistered from scrubbing, his eyes rimmed in shadow. Still, he walked the halls, spoke to every healer, listened to every suggestion, every doubt. When one priest dared whisper that the plague was punishment for his heresies, he did not respond with anger. He simply said, "Then let me carry it." That night, fever took him. It came like a thief, silent and sudden. He collapsed on the floor of the infirmary as he was changing the wrappings on an elder's leg. Denef found him there, soaked in sweat, murmuring half-formed prayers in a language that wasn't his own, a language perhaps from dreams. They carried him to the upper chamber, darkened the windows, and summoned every healer back. He drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he said strange things. Once he whispered, "Did we ever plant the fig tree near the river? Or did I only dream it?" Another time, "Tell the sun not to wait for me. I have no shadow today." He stopped speaking after the third day. The fever deepened. The court began to panic. Even those who had once doubted him now prayed aloud, clutching beads, burning myrrh in shallow bowls. Some wept openly. Others stood frozen in their chambers, afraid that the last thread holding Egypt together might now unravel. Denef did not leave his side. He sat beside the pharaoh day and night, eyes wide and silent, hands always resting lightly on the blanket, as if to remind the world that someone still watched. On the 6th night, the fever broke. Sweat poured from the pharaoh's body like rain from a stone. He gasped once, deeply, as though his lungs had forgotten their own hunger. Then he slept, not a drifting, fevered slumber, but deep, clean sleep. When he woke, the sun was rising. The window had been opened. The curtains danced like slow birds, and beside him, still awake, still watching, was the boy. "You stayed," the pharaoh said, his voice a whisper. "I was afraid to leave," Denef replied, blinking fast. The pharaoh tried to rise, but his body betrayed him. "You were dying," Denef said. "I was becoming," the pharaoh answered. A few days later, the sickness began to ease. The waters receded. The breath returned to the people. The court hailed it as divine mercy. The priests declared the pharaoh's suffering had purified the land. He said nothing. He simply walked to the house of the unspoken and added a new scroll by his own hand. It read, "To suffer is not to be punished. To survive is not to be rewarded. We are not gods. We are the ones who hold each other through the fire and live to speak of it." And he signed it not with his name, but with a symbol, a single circle, open at the top. Like a mouth, inhaling. Like a soul, never closed. The heat returned with a quiet vengeance. The rains had gone, the sickness had passed, but the earth was no longer the same. The Nile ran lower than before, and the soil drank more greedily. The farmers knew this language. They read it in the curling of leaves, in the hardening of furrows, in the way birds flew higher, searching. But inside the palace, another current stirred, one of memory. In the weeks following his recovery, the pharaoh moved differently. Not slowly, but deliberately, as if each step was being measured against something no one else could see. He no longer lingered by the river. He no longer wandered the gardens. Instead, he began writing. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, he would sit at a low cedarwood table in the quietest chamber of the eastern wing. Denef would bring ink and fresh reed pens, and then he would leave, closing the door behind him. No one entered while the pharaoh wrote. He did not dictate. He did not speak. He simply wrote. The scribes speculated wildly. Was it a new law, a secret doctrine, a prayer, a confession? The truth was something stranger. He was writing his own story, not the story carved into temple walls or echoed in priestly chants, not the myth of a divine birth or a god walking among men, but the story of a boy who had learned the sound of stone cracking beneath silence, a boy who named a cat Dust and once ran 6 steps before being stopped, a boy who loved a voice he never dared to touch, and who learned how to rule not through power, but through listening. He wrote not with grandeur, but with weight, not to be remembered, but to finally remember himself. Each sentence carried the shape of moments he had hidden even from his own heart. He wrote of the first time he felt loneliness, not in the chamber of power, but the moment he realized his laughter frightened people. He wrote of the night his father died and the morning he was crowned before he knew how to cry. He wrote of the old potter who once said he wanted to shape something no one dared use, and how the pharaoh had understood more deeply than he admitted. He wrote of the library of the unspoken, of Horotep, of the blind storyteller, of the fever. He wrote until the ink ran dry. Then he paused, closed his eyes, waited for the stillness, and wrote again. This ritual lasted for 30 days. At the end of the 30th day, he summoned Denef. The boy, now older in posture than in age, entered without speaking. The pharaoh handed him a bundle of parchment tied in blue cord. This, he said, must not go to the temple. Denef nodded. It must not be read by those who wear crowns. Another nod. Bury it where the reeds grow thickest. Denef looked up, eyes glassy. Will they ever find it? The pharaoh smiled faintly. Only if they're looking for something they don't know they've lost. He placed his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. Not as a king, not as a teacher, as a man. That night, Denef walked to the banks of the river, just beyond the palace, where the reeds grew in tall, whispering clusters. He dug with his hands. The soil was soft, the roots tangled like stories never told. He placed the bundle carefully, wrapped in linen to protect it from the moisture, and covered it again with earth. He did not mark the spot. He simply listened, as the wind moved through the reeds like breath over old wounds. Back in the palace, the pharaoh sat alone, watching the moonlight curve over the polished stone floor. He thought of his mother, now long dead, of the queen who had once tried to marry him into politics, of generals who had once stood like mountains, now retired to the quiet of their own estates, of the scribe's daughter, of Dust. He whispered her name once, not to summon her, but to honor the ache. The following morning he ordered a feast, not for celebration but for remembering. No nobles were invited, only servants, gardeners, builders, healers, the men who had scrubbed the palace floors during the fever, the women who had fed orphans when grain ran thin, the boys who had run between granaries carrying news when the scribes were too slow. They came hesitantly, some barefoot, others stunned. They had never stepped into the banquet hall except to clean it, but there they sat, and the pharaoh joined them. He did not sit at the raised platform. He sat on the ground. He broke bread, shared dates, laughed gently, listened to jokes, learned names. At one point, a servant girl no older than 10 offered him a small bundle, woven reeds tied together into the shape of a falcon. "I made it," she said shyly. He took it in both hands. "It's beautiful," he said. She beamed. Later, he placed it on the altar in his personal chamber, not before a god, but beside the pen he had once hidden in a stone wall. That night, as the last candles flickered out and the palace exhaled into darkness, he stood before his window. The stars were vast, unmoving, but he no longer looked to them for approval. He simply stood there, eyes reflecting the ancient light, and for the first time he did not wonder who he was. He knew. He was not the voice of the gods. He was the echo of the people. The morning after the feast, the palace lingered in a hush that wasn't silence. It was fullness, as though the halls themselves remembered the laughter that had spilled across the banquet floor the night before. Servants moved gently, without the stiffness of ceremony. Musicians hummed absent-mindedly. Even the guards, ever rigid, leaned just slightly against the pillars, as if the stone had grown softer overnight. But the pharaoh was already awake, long before the first bowls of figs and barley were placed for breakfast. He stood by the temple lake, alone. The water was still. It reflected the sky so clearly that for a moment he felt suspended between two worlds, one above, one below, both indifferent and eternal. He reached into the pocket of his robe and took out the reed falcon the little girl had given him. Its shape was simple, almost crude, but its wings had been woven with care. He traced them with his thumb. Behind him, a soft voice spoke. "I thought I might find you here." He turned. It was the blind storyteller. The old man leaned on his cane, his robes dusty from travel, his expression calm. "I was told you'd return south," the pharaoh said. "I did, then I came back. The river asked me to." The pharaoh raised an eyebrow. "The river?" "Everything speaks when you've gone blind," the man chuckled. "Even the things that never had a mouth." He stepped closer, moving with the slow grace of someone who has made peace with time. "I've been hearing a story," he said, "a strange one, about a boy who was made into a god and then tried to become a man again." The pharaoh tilted his head. "Does the story have an ending?" The old man smiled. "Not yet, that's why I came." They stood there for a long while, the water whispering between them. Eventually the pharaoh gestured to the bench by the edge of the lake. They sat, no ceremony, no guards, just two men, one who could not see and one who had spent most of his life trying not to be seen. The storyteller reached into his satchel and drew out a small flute, cracked and worn, but still whole. "I used to play for children in the markets," he said, "before my eyes went dark. Now I just play for memory." And he began. The notes were soft, imperfect, often dipping too low or rising just shy of their mark. But they held something ancient, something older than perfection. They carried the weight of footsteps on dry earth, of lullabies sung to sleeping goats, of laughter shared under thatched roofs. The pharaoh closed his eyes. For a moment, he was a child again. Before scrolls, before ceremonies, before the first lesson in divinity. Just a small boy hiding from the sun in a basket near the riverbank, listening to the world breathe. When the song ended, neither man spoke for a while. Then the storyteller asked, "Do you ever wonder if the gods are still watching?" The pharaoh didn't answer right away. "I think they're tired," he said at last. "Tired of being blamed, tired of being begged, tired of hearing their names used as weapons." "Do you still believe in them?" "I believe in the silence they left behind," the pharaoh replied, "and the echoes we keep trying to name." The old man nodded, as if that was enough, and it was. Later that day, a messenger arrived from the outer provinces. He came on foot, dusty, breathless, carrying a clay tablet marked with the insignia of the western border town of Shakut. He bowed low and presented the message with trembling hands. It was not a request for aid. It was not a political matter. It was a question. "May we build a school in the name of the pharaoh who listens?" The pharaoh read the words twice. Then he smiled, a slow, quiet smile that touched the corners of his eyes. He summoned the architect of the palace, an old woman with a voice like gravel and eyes that missed nothing. "Draw me a school," he said, "but not of stone." She frowned. "What else then?" "Build it from questions," he replied. "Make the walls from wonder. Let the foundation be made of disagreements. Let the children walk on floors that were never the same 2 days in a row." She stared at him. Then, for the first time in many years, she laughed. Finally, she said, a design worth aging for. That year, 20 schools were begun across Egypt. None bore the pharaoh's face. None spoke of divine lineage. Only questions carved above their entrances. What is the shape of truth? Who owns silence? Forget. And how do we begin again? Each school was built beside a garden where students could speak to trees as often as they did to scrolls. Teachers were chosen not for their lineage, but for their curiosity. Lessons were not dictated, they were discovered. And slowly, the land began to shift. Not with rebellion, not with fire, but with memory uncoiling. Farmers taught their children to ask why the seasons changed, not just when. Fishermen told their sons and daughters how to listen to the river, not command it. Stoneworkers began leaving small carvings beneath the foundations of temples, hidden messages, small riddles, invisible until the stone wore down. The pharaoh walked the land, quietly visiting these schools. He never announced himself. He sat on dirt floors, listened to debates between children too young to understand who he was, and left behind only a folded piece of reed with a question written on it. Each different, each sacred. No one ever saw him place them, but they became legend. The pharaoh's questions, they were called. And in that gentle mystery, a new myth was born. Not of a god ruling from a throne, but of a man walking barefoot through fields of questions, planting silence where the old world had only demanded answers. The years passed quietly like wind reshaping dunes. Nothing collapsed. No palace was stormed. No statue was torn down by angry hands. But the changes, the real ones, deepened like river roots beneath the sand, hidden from the eye, but everywhere. The pharaoh aged, not with disgrace but with stillness. The sharp angles of his face softened. His beard, once blackened with perfumed oil, now bore streaks of silver. His voice, once clear and unwavering, sometimes trembled, not from uncertainty, but from having carried too many names for too long. And yet he was more present than ever. He no longer slept in the royal chamber. He had moved into a small stone house near the east wall of the palace gardens. It had only 2 rooms, one for sleeping, one for writing. No gold, no guards, just reed mats, wooden shelves, and a bowl for washing. He grew his own herbs in clay pots along the windowsill. Every morning, he rose before dawn and tended to them. Mint, fennel, lotus root. It calmed him, this act of slow devotion. It reminded him that creation did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered. The court resisted at first. They sent messages, offered larger quarters, reminded him of obligations. He answered none of them. Instead, he sent copies of questions, ones he had written at night when sleep eluded him. When did we start mistaking silence for approval? Is loyalty still loyalty when it is born from fear? What kind of empire grows stronger when it stops pretending it is eternal? Eventually, the court stopped asking him to return. They adjusted. Some began to imitate him, removing the gold from their sandals, speaking less in meetings, pretending humility like it was a new garment. But those who merely performed the quiet were always obvious to those who lived within it. Meanwhile, the schools grew, and something unexpected began to rise beside them. Songs. Not hymns to gods or chants in temple tongues, but songs born from children's laughter, from questions turned into rhyme. Street musicians picked them up. Mothers sang them while weaving. They carried through alleyways and riverboats, filling Egypt not with doctrine, but with wonder. One such song made its way back to the pharaoh. A boy sang it to him in a courtyard one afternoon. What does the sun dream of when it closes its eyes? Does it miss the river, the reeds, the flies? Does it forget the pharaoh's name, or whisper it like a secret flame? The pharaoh had closed his eyes and listened until the last note drifted away. Later that evening, he asked Thenef, now a man in his 20s, bearded, tall, ever silent, to carve that song into the base of the smallest obelisk in the palace garden. No titles, he said, no names, just the words. Let it be the only stone I leave behind. The Neph did as asked, but deep beneath the carving, he etched a single glyph, a circle open at the top. For years now, the pharaoh had refused to commission new statues. The old ones had been removed from the temples, not destroyed, but relocated to the outer gardens where vines and time could take their course. Some crumbled, some remained, but none were worshipped. Still, the people did not forget him. They came not with offerings, but with stories. Fishermen told of a time the pharaoh helped mend a net, A potter whispered how he once watched the king sweep dust from a temple stair without being noticed. A girl, now grown, swore she once heard him speak to a tree as if it were his brother. And in the southern villages, it was said that sometimes, just before the harvest moon, he would appear without warning to help bind the grain and vanish before dawn. He never confirmed these stories, but neither did he deny them. They were not about truth. They were about hope. And that, he understood now, was the only kind of myth worth carrying. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, he sat with Thenef by the lotus pond. The water was still. The frogs had begun their evening chorus, and the scent of myrrh drifted faintly from a brazier nearby. Thenef asked, "Will there be another after you?" The pharaoh smiled. "There's always another. I don't mean a king. I mean someone like you." "No one is like another," the pharaoh said. "But if someone listens, really listens, and chooses to ask instead of command, then yes, there will be more." Thenef stared into the pond, quiet. The pharaoh placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to become me," he said. "Just become real." And they sat together in silence, two men who had unlearned power, who had remembered the value of stillness, and who now understood that true legacy was not built in gold, but in the way people feel when they say your name, or when they don't and still remember. The summer that followed was the hottest in a generation. The stone of the palace walls retained the sun's heat long into the night, so that even the moonlight seemed to shimmer with exhaustion. Crops wilted early. Wells drew slower. Dogs howled less. The wind, when it came, felt dry and confused. But the pharaoh endured it the way he endured all things now, quietly, without armor. He no longer sat in judgment, no longer gave audience. His presence had shifted, less like a king, more like a shadow at the edge of a tree, constant, unnoticed, but unmistakably there. He spent his mornings walking the outer fields of the city. Children followed him sometimes, giggling, pretending he was a wandering sage or a retired magician who had once spoken to birds. They invented stories about him, that he could make seeds grow by humming, that he could turn snakes into reeds with a glance, that he never slept because the stars came to tell him their secrets. He encouraged none of these, but never corrected them either. Truth, he'd come to understand, wasn't always about facts. It was about the shape of what people needed. One morning, while passing through a village near the edge of the delta, he came upon a funeral procession. It was a poor one, no linens, no offerings, just a wrapped body on a reed mat and 4 women weeping with the practiced grace of those who buried too many. He watched from a distance, then stepped forward and asked, "May I carry one end?" The mourners looked at him in silence. No one stopped him. He placed his hands beneath the mat. The body was light, a boy, perhaps 15, one of many claimed by the heat. As they walked, someone began to hum, a low, slow tune. One of the weeping women joined in, then another. By the time they reached the burial ground, the song had grown into something fragile and sacred, the kind of melody that disappears the moment you try to remember it. After the burial, he sat with the mourners beneath a fig tree. They shared water, figs, and silence. When they asked who he was, he only said, "I once forgot how to mourn. I'm trying to remember." They nodded. They didn't need his name. That evening, back in the city, he returned to the house of the unspoken. It had grown large over the years, not in walls, but in pages. Shelves now stretched toward the ceiling, each filled with scrolls written not by priests or scribes, but by ordinary hands, farmers, midwives, merchants, children. Each scroll told a story once ignored, once buried. He wandered the aisles slowly, running his fingers across the edges of parchment, like touching the spine of a sleeping animal. At the very back of the house, in a corner few visited, he placed a new scroll. It contained no words, just an imprint of the reed mat he had carried, pressed gently into the parchment while it was still wet. He left it there, unlabeled, a record of a boy, a memory without explanation. That night, he dreamed, not of gods, not of battles, but of the scribe's daughter. In the dream, she was standing on the palace wall looking out toward the desert. He walked beside her, barefoot. "You remember me now?" she asked, not turning. "I never forgot," he said. "You tried to." He nodded. "Yes." She looked at him then, her face both older and exactly the same. "Did it hurt?" He didn't ask what she meant. "Yes." "And was it worth it?" He thought for a long time, then whispered, "It had to be." She reached out, touched his hand and said, "Then don't stop now." He woke before dawn. The window was open. A soft breeze moved through the room. He sat up slowly, bones creaking, heart steady. He reached for his writing board and ink and wrote just one sentence. "Sometimes love is what we carry, not what we hold." Then he rose, bathed in a clay basin, dressed in plain linen, and stepped outside. The first light of day touched the earth like a promise, and he began to walk, not toward the palace, not toward the court, but toward the open road beyond the city, alone, not leaving anything behind, but bringing everything with him. He walked for 3 days, not as a ruler, not as a pilgrim, not even as a man seeking revelation. He walked as one might trace the lines of a scar, not to heal it, but to know it. The sandals he wore were plain and thin. By the second morning, he had tied strips of linen around his heels. By the third, he had abandoned footwear entirely, letting the earth mark him as it pleased. The path was not planned. He followed the sun by day and the wind by evening. He stopped where water whispered, slept where shade allowed, ate dates offered by strangers who didn't know him, or if they did, didn't say so. It was only by the fourth morning that he recognized where his feet had led him, a place half forgotten, a village near the northern bend of the Nile, barely more than a scatter of huts and reed fences. But he knew the curve of the stream, the tilt of the tallest palm, the way the lotus flowers bunched at the water's edge. He had been here before, long ago, the last time he had truly laughed, the last time he had asked someone a question he didn't already know the answer to. She had lived here, the scribe's daughter. He walked the edge of the village, uncertain, not with fear, but with reverence, like entering a temple long abandoned, unsure if it still housed breath. Most of the huts were new, their mud walls freshly patched. Children played near the water. A woman washed garments beside a stone. Chickens scattered as he passed. No one bowed. No one fled. He was no longer the shape they feared. He reached the house without asking. It was smaller than he remembered. The door had changed. The old olive tree beside it had grown twisted and tired, its roots gnarled like old fingers. He stood there for a long time, then knocked. The door opened slowly, and there she was. Older, of course. Lines around her eyes, streaks of gray in her braid. But the moment she looked at him, the years collapsed like tents in the wind. She didn't gasp, didn't bow, didn't speak. She stepped aside and he entered. The house smelled of clay and herbs. There was no throne, no cushions of gold, just a reed mat, a wooden stool, a jug of water. They sat. Silence bloomed between them, not awkward, not heavy, just full. She poured water into a shallow bowl, passed it to him. He drank, and finally she said, "I wondered if you would ever come back." "I didn't know I would," he said. "But you hoped." He nodded. They didn't speak of titles, or of what had been taken, or of the years lost to crowns and ceremonies and silence. That would come later, or not at all. Instead, they talked of smaller things, the smell of wet stone in the morning, the way birds had changed their calls that year, how the river had carved a new channel half a mile south. She told him her father had died a decade ago, peacefully, under a fig tree, that she had never married, that she had taught children to read by scratching symbols into the dirt with sticks. He told her about the schools, about the house of the unspoken, about Horotep and Theneth. She listened with the same gaze she had once given him in the palace gardens, steady, unblinking, as if what he said mattered not for its grandeur, but for its truth. When the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long, she asked, "Why now?" "Because I have nothing left to perform," he said. "Only something to return to." She looked away then, toward the small window facing the river. "You were always trying to leave something behind," she said, "even when you didn't know what." "I thought it would be monuments," he replied. "And now," he smiled faintly, "now I hope it's silence." She rose, walked to a basket in the corner, and brought out something wrapped in old cloth. She placed it in his lap. He opened it slowly, a reed pen, frayed, dried, nearly hollow. He stared at it for a long time. "You kept it," he whispered. "I said it would outlast you." He laughed, just once, and it didn't echo. It simply stayed in the room, soft and round, like a sleeping animal finally exhaling. That night, he slept beneath her roof, on the floor. No ceremony, no incense, just the sound of water outside and the comfort of walls that had never held a crown. And before he closed his eyes, he turned to her in the dark and said, Not as a pharaoh, not as a man seeking redemption, but simply as himself. Thank you for never believing I was a god. She answered with 5 words. You were always more than that. The next morning was golden with dust. Light spilled through the gaps in the reed ceiling in soft ribbons, catching on the motes in the air like tiny shimmering prayers. The pharaoh, no longer in name, no longer needing the word, woke slowly. Not with urgency, not with ritual. Just the stretch of old bones and a breath drawn without fear. She was already outside. He found her near the stream, sleeves rolled, kneeling by a basket of linens. Her hands moved with the rhythm of habit, not haste. A child passed behind her, chasing a goat. The goat ignored both of them. He stood quietly for a while, then joined her, sitting on the flat rock nearby. You still wake early, he said. She wrung the cloth with a small smile. Some habits are less heavy than others. They spoke little that morning. Their words were now the spaces between sentences. He helped rinse the cloths, his hands awkward at first, unused to such simple labor. But the water was warm from the sun, and it taught him what it needed. Less grip, more patience. By midday, she brought out bread and lentils. They ate beneath the shade of the old olive tree. A breeze passed through its dry branches and scattered leaves like falling thoughts. I've stayed too long, he said softly, brushing crumbs from his lap. She raised an eyebrow. You've only stayed a day. It feels like the end of something. She looked down at her hands. Maybe it is. He paused, then asked, May I come back? Only if you don't return as a pharaoh. He nodded. I won't. I can't. I've left that behind me. She looked at him then, long and clear. Good, then there might still be room for you here. He helped her gather the laundry and hang it across the wooden poles behind the house. The wet cloth flapped in the afternoon heat. It reminded him of temple banners once hung in his name. Those had snapped louder, but these smelled of soap and sun and were heavier with truth. That evening before leaving, she gave him a pouch. For the road, she said. He opened it. Inside were 3 things: a dried fig, a piece of linen folded tight, and the reed pen. You don't have to keep giving me this, he said gently. She shook her head. I'm not giving it to you. I'm reminding you that what you wrote with it still matters. He placed the pouch over his shoulder. I don't know where I'm going next. You never did, she said. That's what I liked about you. He turned to go, then paused at the path. Will you be here if I return? I'll be somewhere, she said, whether here or in a story someone tells. He smiled and walked. The road felt different now, not narrower, not harder, just clearer, like something had shifted under the dust and stones, making space for his steps. He passed farmers loading bales of barley onto carts. Children waved at him from rooftops. A donkey bleated near a half-dried canal. And through it all, he walked quietly, carrying nothing but pouch and the silence that no longer burdened him. He spent the night beneath an acacia tree beside a dying fire. Above, the stars unfolded in patterns he no longer needed to name. He didn't dream, or if he did, he no longer chased those dreams through fog and fever. He simply let them pass through him, like wind over water. When morning came, he walked again. He followed the river until it split, then turned east into the hills. The terrain roughened, the paths narrowed, villages became sparse. But everywhere he went, he listened. To old men telling stories to dogs, to women grinding grain and humming to themselves, to children asking impossible questions. In one village, he sat beside a boy who was tracing spirals into the dirt with a stick. What are you drawing? The man asked. Wind, the boy said, but before it moves. He nodded and sat beside him, watching. In another place, he found a woman painting the inside of a clay pot with symbols he didn't recognize. They're not words, she said, just sounds I haven't heard yet. He laughed softly and she smiled. In each place, he left nothing. No tokens, no signs, only his presence, like the momentary stillness of dusk before the air cools. One night, alone beside a salt flat where no trees grew, he opened the linen folded in the pouch. Inside was a scrap of papyrus. He hadn't noticed it before. On it, she had written 5 words, "What remains when we stop?" He sat with the question until the stars came out, then wrote beneath it with the reed pen, "Ourselves," and folded it away again. The desert began to rise around him. Not the soft dunes of the outer provinces, but the harder earth, the kind that cracked like old paint, where thorns grew without leaves and birds circled far overhead, not singing, only watching. Few passed through here. The caravans avoided it. The priests called it the spine of the sky, where the gods once walked but left nothing behind. He walked it alone. The silence here was deeper, older, not absence of sound, but presence of stillness. It wrapped around him with no malice, just indifference. The air shimmered in the daylight, and the nights came fast and cold. He carried no firewood. Instead, he watched the stars flicker until sleep took him. One evening on the fourth night, he came upon something unexpected. Ruins, not grand, not marked on any scroll, just half-sunken stones jutting from the sand like ribs, fragments of columns, a collapsed archway. He approached slowly, brushing his fingers across the glyphs half buried in grit. They were not in the temple tongue. Older, cruder. He couldn't read them, but he could feel them. Names once spoken aloud, now eroded into shapes. He stepped between the fallen stones and found a circle of rock, blackened from old fire, surrounded by fragments of clay vessels and animal bones, a place where people had once gathered, prayed, or maybe just waited. At the center was a slab, flat, weathered. It bore no inscription, but someone long ago had carved a single line across its face, not a word, just a line, straight, clean, a division, or a path. He sat beside it, folding his legs. The wind howled low between the rocks, and he listened for hours, until his mind stopped reaching for meaning and began to accept the quiet as its own kind of answer. When he stood again, he placed the reed pen on the stone slab, a gift, an offering, a pause. Then he turned and walked on. 2 days later, he reached a small settlement nestled at the base of a red cliff. Barely a dozen huts, a dry well, a goat tied to a wooden stake chewing sand. He entered without speaking. An old woman sat weaving rope from palm fiber. She looked up, then down again. "You walk the spine," she said. He nodded. She pointed to a hut. "You can sleep there." That night, someone brought him lentil broth and dates. No one asked who he was. They had seen his eyes. He stayed 3 days, helped repair a wall, taught a boy how to wrap a sprained ankle, drew water with a cracked pulley, repaired a flute for a girl who hadn't played since her brother died. On the fourth morning, he left without farewell. The people didn't stop him. They knew travelers like him did not linger. They carried too much silence to stay in one place. He moved now not with purpose, but with presence. He passed shepherds who spoke to their sheep as if they were priests. He met a woman who painted dreams onto clay shards, then buried them so they couldn't come true. He crossed paths with a man who spoke only in riddles, and one of those riddles stuck in his mind for days. What shape does water take when it forgets what it's reflecting? He didn't answer. He simply kept walking. In one village, he sat beside a well as evening fell, surrounded by children drawing circles in the dust. One girl, no older than 7, leaned close and whispered, "Are you real?" He looked at her, eyes soft. "Do I need to be?" She grinned, missing a tooth. "No, I just wanted to know," and ran off laughing. That night he dreamed again, not of palaces or temples, but of the house of the unspoken. It was larger now in his dream, its walls lined not just with scrolls, but with voices, suspended in air like lanterns. Each whispered a name, a regret, a promise. He walked through it barefoot, touching each one lightly. When he reached the back corner, where his imprint scroll had once been laid, he found a reed pen waiting, new, unmarked, and beside it, a small note. "You are not finished." He woke before the sun, and for the first time in weeks he turned around, back toward the river, back toward the people, not because he had something to reclaim, but because his silence had grown roots, and roots too must be shared. The river appeared like a memory, first as a shimmer between trees, then as sound distant and sure, and finally as a curve of blue between reeds and dust. He stood at the edge of the water, not touching it yet. The Nile had always been more than a river. It was the breath of the land, the slow heartbeat beneath stone and ceremony. It had outlived every throne. It would outlive him. He knelt and cupped water in his palms. It was cool, heavy, real. He drank and for a long time said nothing. When he finally rose, he followed the river north. He moved at the pace of the current, unhurried, deliberate. Sometimes he walked alongside fishermen casting nets, sometimes alone, with only the creak of bulrushes for company. By the time he reached the city's edge, the sun was high. He did not enter through the palace gates. He walked instead to the eastern fields, where laborers hauled bricks and children chased flies between irrigation ditches. One boy paused mid-run, eyes widening, then sprinted off. Before long, word spread, not of the Pharaoh's return, but of his return, the man without a name, the one who had walked the land and left questions instead of commands. People began to gather, not in masses, in moments. They followed him quietly, women with their baskets still on hips, men wiping mortar from their fingers, children with faces dusted by sun and river silt. He said little, only nodded, smiled, listened. He did not go back to the throne room. He went to the school, the first one, the one built from cracked stone and patient questions. It stood just beyond the city wall, beside a fig grove. The children were inside, scribbling symbols on clay tablets. The teacher paused as he entered, but did not bow. Instead, she stepped aside. He walked among the students slowly. One child looked up, confused. "You were a story," he said. "I still am," the man answered. The children crowded around him, curious but not afraid. "What did you used to be?" asked a girl with ink on her cheek. "I used to be believed," he said. "More than I believed myself." A silence followed. Then the teacher asked gently, "Why did you come back?" He glanced toward the window, where sunlight pooled on the floor like spilled honey. "Because I think I finally know what I want to leave behind." He stepped outside and sat beneath the fig tree, his back against its thick roots. Within the hour, the Neph arrived, older now, weathered, taller. Their eyes met and no words passed, only stillness. The Neph sat beside him, in his hands a wrapped bundle. The man unfolded it carefully, a fresh bundle of reeds, ink and parchment. The Neph said nothing. The man smiled. That evening they wrote together. Not decrees, not memories, but a guide for anyone who would one day wear a crown. It was not a law book, not a doctrine. It was a collection of moments. A boy's question by a well, a potter's quiet dream, a healer's trembling hands, a village's forgotten dead. A reed pen passed across time. Each page began not with "you must," but with "remember." Remember, silence is not absence. Remember, fear bends truth. Remember, love may leave, but it also plants. They wrote long after dark. The moon hung low. Oil lamps flickered. And when at last the guide was finished, the man placed it inside a clay jar, sealed it with wax, and carved 3 words into its side: for the listener. The next morning, he walked once more to the house of the unspoken. Its doors were open. Inside, scrolls lined every wall, piled on benches, nestled in corners. Voices remembered. He found the scroll with the line of the burial mat and placed the jar beside it. No label, no fanfare, just presence. Then, before leaving, he whispered a short phrase into the air: "I forgive you." No one heard him. No one needed to. He walked back into the daylight, where a child handed him a stone with a spiral scratched into its surface. "What's it mean?" the child asked. He turned it in his fingers. "It means you've started something," he said, then gave the stone back and walked on. The road west of the city shimmered with heat, a long ribbon of dust and stone uncoiling toward the low hills where the sun disappeared each evening. He followed it with no destination, only direction. His feet moved as if remembering an old rhythm, one not taught by priests or marked by festivals, but born in the souls of those who had walked before him, farmers, messengers, seekers. He passed small villages where people no longer paused to ask who he was. They offered water, a place in the shade, sometimes only a glance of recognition, not of name, but of presence. At the edge of a small town called Meru, he paused beneath a date palm to rest. A young man approached, tall, nervous, his hands stained with ink. "I waited," the young man said. The traveler looked up. "For what?" "For someone who would tell me what to do," the man answered. "And did one come?" "You did." The traveler smiled gently. "I don't tell people what to do." The young man sat beside him. "Then how do we know we're doing the right thing?" "You won't," the traveler said. "Not at first. Sometimes not ever. But if it brings more quiet than pride, you're close." They shared a small loaf of bread and watched 2 hawks circling in the pale sky. That night, the traveler slept beneath the stars, as he had done so many times before. But this night was different. There was a stillness in the air. Not silence, but a kind of final exhale, as if something old and unfinished had decided to rest at last. He dreamt of the olive tree outside her house. Its branches bore fruit heavy with light, and she stood beneath them, holding a cup carved from fig wood. She said nothing. He didn't need her to. When he woke, the sun was only a pale smear on the horizon. He rose slowly, bones reminding him of the time that had passed. He He no longer rushed to hide his age. He wore it openly like a traveler's dust. By midday, he reached a plateau overlooking the western valley. Below, fields shimmered golden, dotted with oxen and the bowed silhouettes of workers. He sat on a rock and watched. Hours passed. Shadows lengthened. Children's voices carried faintly on the wind. Behind him, someone approached. Soft steps, measured. He didn't turn. "I wondered when you'd find me," he said. The Neff sat beside him, breathing heavily from the climb. He was older now, not yet gray, but touched by it. "I didn't come to bring you back," he said. "I know. I came to stay." The traveler looked at him surprised. "You were always meant to return," the Neff continued, "but I never left." The wind shifted. They sat in silence, watching a hawk dive, then rise again. "People still talk about you," the Neff said at last, "but not the way they used to. How do they speak now? Like you were something soft that touched the world." The traveler smiled. "Good." They made camp on the ridge crag. The Neff lit a small fire, and they shared a gourd of wine and a pouch of dried figs. After they had eaten, the younger man pulled a scroll from his satchel. "People have started writing their own questions," he said. "The children especially. The schools call them echo leaves." The traveler laughed. "What do they ask?" The Neff unrolled the scroll. By firelight, he read them aloud. "Why do birds never look tired? Does the moon get lonely when we sleep? Can silence be louder than thunder? What happens to words we forget?" The traveler leaned back, eyes soft. "They've surpassed me. They learned from you." "No," he said. "They remembered through me." The Neff gently rolled the scroll and set it beside the fire. The stars turned slowly overhead. At some point, the traveler spoke again. "When I die," he said, "don't build me a tomb. I won't. Don't carve my name into stone. I won't. Just take the questions, scatter them." The Neff nodded. "Like seeds." The fire crackled low. The traveler lay back on his mat, one arm behind his head, watching sparks drift into the sky, and whispered, not to anyone, but into the wind, "I am ready to be forgotten so they can remember themselves." At dawn, the valley shimmered with a low mist, silver and weightless. The traveler rose before the sun had fully crested the hills, the fire long extinguished, the Neff still asleep beside it. He stood quietly, as though trying not to disturb even the dust beneath his feet. The world felt hushed, reverent, as if it too was listening. He walked down the slope alone, step by step, letting gravity pull him gently forward. Each movement slow, deliberate. He passed through stalks of barley brushing against his legs, through the fields where insects stirred and birds rose into the day. The village at the base of the valley had no name carved in stone. It lived simply. Women ground grain near open doors. A boy drew symbols in a patch of sand, mimicking the call of birds. Somewhere, someone was singing, low, rhythmic, a melody of habit more than performance. He paused at a well, waited his turn behind an elder, then drew water with quiet hands. He drank deeply, let it wash through him. He had no plan to stay, and yet something told him not to leave just yet. A child approached, barefoot, no more than 6, with wide eyes and a garland of dried river reeds strung like a necklace in her hands. "Are you the one who asks questions?" she said. He knelt, smiling. "I was," he said. She held out the garland. "For you," she whispered. He accepted it as though it were gold. She didn't wait for thanks. She turned and ran, laughing, arms outstretched like wings. He wore the garland as he walked through the village. People offered him small things, a folded leaf of salted cheese, a carved shell, a prayer spoken not to him but near him. He never once introduced himself. He no longer needed to. Later, beneath the shade of a fig tree, a group of villagers gathered. They brought mats, food, music, but most of all, they brought stories. Not of pharaohs, not of gods, but of themselves. They told of moments that had no name. The time a blind man found a well by scent. The time 2 sisters argued and then laughed until they wept. The dream someone had of a staircase made of water. The traveler listened, eyes half closed, hands folded on his lap. And when asked if he had a story to share, he simply said, "I once believed I needed to be remembered. Then I learned that memory isn't something you leave behind. It's something others carry forward." A silence settled over them, not heavy, not uncertain, but full, like a bowl filled with still water. A woman spoke. She was older than most there, her hair wrapped in a cloth that had once been blue, now faded to the color of clouds. "Will you stay here?" she asked. He looked toward the horizon. Only long enough to vanish, he said, and they understood. The next morning, they found him sitting at the edge of the field, watching the sun rise through the stalks. His eyes were open, but his breath had gone quiet. He was holding the garland in his lap. No ceremony followed, only a shared understanding. They wrapped his body in linen, placed a stone under his head, and buried him beneath the fig tree where he had listened. No marker was carved, but beside the grave, a child traced spirals into the earth with a reed. One by one, others followed. They brought their own questions, scratched into clay, whispered into the roots, drawn in the dust with sticks. Some would say he was never there, that he was a story shaped by stories, but others would remember the man who walked without sandals, who wrote without titles, who asked the world not to worship him, but to ask itself who it had forgotten. And above the tree, as seasons turned, the leaves whispered those questions in the wind, not to be answered, but to be passed on. Years passed like river silt settling over memory, soft, slow, quiet. The village beneath the fig tree remained, though it changed as all things do. Children became parents. Clay walls were rebuilt after each season's rain. The tree grew thicker, roots deepening, its shadow stretching longer each year as if trying to reach towards something it once knew. People did not speak of the traveler often, not out of forgetfulness, but reverence. His name was not repeated, but his gestures lived in the folds of daily life. A child listening before speaking, a farmer pausing before harvesting, eyes lifted to the sky. A teacher beginning a lesson with, "What question brought you here today?" At the edge of the fig tree's shade, where the earth still held a different quiet, small stones began to gather. One by one, left without fanfare, flat stones with markings, symbols, drawings, a spiral, a single line, a reed, a circle open at the top. No one told the children to bring them. They simply did. One morning, a young girl from a distant village arrived, following a story her grandmother had told her by the fire. She had walked 2 days carrying a wrapped bundle beneath her robe. She found the fig tree and sat beneath it, tired but determined. She unwrapped the bundle. Inside, a scroll, thin, worn, with the words of a child written in careful hand. What happens to the sky when no one is watching it? She placed it among the stones. A few other children watched. None spoke, but later another scroll appeared, and another. Soon a woven basket was placed beneath the tree to keep the questions dry. The village called it the listening place. It had no guardian, no door, no altar, only an agreement that what was brought here would be kept, not in answers, but in care. Elsewhere, the winds shifted over the lands of Egypt. Dynasties rose and fell like breath. Names returned to the temples. Crowns were polished. Statues raised again. War returned. Peace returned. Sand swallowed some cities. Rivers abandoned others. But in certain corners of the kingdom, the old questions remained. They passed hand to hand, scratched into broken pottery, tucked into the hems of robes, carried like seeds on the tongues of storytellers. Then F, before his hair turned white, returned once to the house of the unspoken. He found it changed, not in scale, but in spirit. The scrolls had multiplied, yes, but more than that, so had the voices within them. No longer just accounts of pain and injustice. Now there were songs, dialogues, dreams. He found, tucked among the oldest shelves, a scroll written in charcoal on a faded scrap. When I feel small, I look at the sky and remind myself it does not ask to be big. He sat down beside it and wept for a long time, not out of grief, but release. When he rose, he added a scroll of his own. Some truths cannot be taught. They must be held until they change us. He didn't sign it. None of them did anymore. Years later, in a distant school beside the northern lakes, a teacher began her lesson not with a reading from a scroll, but with a single stone. She placed it on the ground, a spiral etched deep and worn smooth by time. She asked the students, "What does this mean to you?" One boy said, "It's a path." Another whispered, "It's a question." A girl with bright eyes said, "It's what happens when we come back to ourselves." The teacher smiled quietly. "You've all answered correctly." And in that way, the traveler continued, not in monuments, nor in names, nor in gold, but in the breath between questions, in the silence that listens, in the knowing that sometimes the most powerful legacy is not being remembered, but remembered through. There came a season when the Nile did not rise. Not a drought, not entirely, just a hesitation. The rains came late in the south. The river arrived slow, reluctant, as though burdened by too many years of expectation. The reeds stood brittle. The fields cracked beneath the weight of the sun. Whispers moved through Egypt like thin smoke. Some blamed forgotten rituals. Some blamed foreign winds. But in the village beneath the fig tree, no one blamed anything. They watched. They waited. They remembered. The elders sat in the shade and spoke of a man who had once walked barefoot across the land, who had carried questions instead of decrees, who had listened instead of ruling. Some still called him the traveler. Others referred to him simply as the one who paused. A girl named Meret, no more than 12, sat each evening beneath the tree, recording the thoughts of her people in small coils of papyrus. Not laws, not history, just fragments. A woman who no longer dreams, a boy who believes trees can hum, a father who smiles less since the fields cracked. She tied each scroll with a reed and placed them in the basket. By the end of the season, the basket overflowed. One morning, she brought the basket to the elders and asked, "What do we do with what people feel?" One of the elders, a man who had once carried the traveler's water, answered softly, "Let it become something that listens back." So they built, not with stone, not with tools, with space. They cleared a circle beyond the fig tree where the earth was softest. They marked it with woven reed mats and stones etched with the earliest symbols, the spiral, the open circle, the line with no name. They placed no roof over it, no walls, only silence. They called it the still place. People came not to speak but to place. Scrolls, thoughts, objects of grief, fragments of memory. They left things not to be kept, but to be heard. And always someone returned each morning, not to catalog, not to judge, but to witness. One evening, a man from a distant province arrived at the village. He carried no title, but his robes were clean, his sandals well kept. His bearing suggested he had once belonged to the court, perhaps even a priest. He entered the still place and stood quietly. Meret was nearby, sweeping fallen fig leaves into a basket. He approached her. "Who built this?" She looked at him and replied, "Many people, over many days." He studied the circle, then asked, "Is there a shrine?" She shook her head. "There's no need for one." "No statue?" "Only the questions." He frowned slightly. "But how do you know who is honored here?" Meret smiled, small and certain. "We don't." He looked again at the open space, at the offerings, at the absence of form, and something in him shifted. He left before sunrise, saying nothing more. But weeks later, a bundle arrived from the capital, a satchel filled with scrolls, each titled only with a single word: regret, memory, silence, forgiveness, mother. They were added to the basket. No name was written on any of them, and no one needed to ask. The still place became a kind of current, like the Nile itself. It carried what people could not hold alone. There were no sermons, no scripts, just breath, just being. A new custom emerged. Before planting each season, farmers would take a handful of earth from the still place and mix it with the first seeds. Not for luck, not for magic, but to remind the soil and themselves that what is buried in truth will rise with gentleness. And in that dry year, even with the river's reluctance, the fields bore enough, not abundance, but sufficiency. And for the people beneath the fig tree, that was more than enough. In the center of the still place, someone placed a flat stone, no carving, no ink, but every few days a child would place a new reed across it, just one, and no one ever removed them. The year the sun lingered too long, the fig tree dropped its fruit early. They fell soundlessly onto dry earth, soft and overripe, their sweetness drawing bees that hovered and disappeared just as quickly. The tree's roots had grown deep, deeper than any in the village, and still, even it showed signs of strain. Leaves curled at the edges, its shade thinner than it had been in decades. The elders watched in silence. No one panicked. They remembered what had been taught, not in lessons, but in stillness, that the world does not owe abundance, only continuity. In the still place, people left different kinds of scrolls now. They no longer asked questions. They left reminders. Breathe slower today. You are still becoming. Leave space between your words. Not all cracks are breaks. Some are openings. And among them, always the children's additions. Feathers, broken reeds, a half-carved shell, a smooth bone, tiny spirals scratched into pottery shards. One day, Meret found something strange in the center. Not a scroll, not a stone. A reed mat, tightly coiled, sealed with wax. She had never seen it before. It bore no name, no seal, just a single open circle drawn in dark ink. She brought it to the elders, who recognized the symbol and nodded slowly, as though time itself had come to visit. They said nothing, only motioned for her to open it. Inside were 7 pages, all written in the same slow, deliberate hand. Not the hand of youth, but of memory. Each page bore one sentence. She read them aloud, voice barely above the hush of evening wind. We are not remembered for the shape of our crowns, but the weight we chose to set down. 2. The river does not announce its return, it simply returns. Do not mistake the absence of monuments for the absence of meaning. Questions are not doors to be opened. They are windows we must sit beside. The ones who listen without waiting to speak carry more than kings ever ruled. 6. Some legacies are soft because the world was not. If they forget your name, let them remember your silence. Merritt folded the pages again and placed them gently beneath the central stone. No ceremony, only breath. That night the village sat together beneath the tree, though it bore no fruit now. The air was dry, but the silence between them was full of stories, of memory, of the one who had come and gone and somehow remained. A boy asked, "Was he real?" An elder replied, "Does the wind ask if it's seen?" The boy fell quiet, watching the tree's branches shiver against the sky. At the edge of the still place, a traveler arrived just before dawn. She was young, cloaked in dust, a woven satchel across her back. She carried a single scroll. She placed it gently near the stone and sat cross-legged in the sand. When the villagers asked why she had come, she only said, "I heard this was where the questions sleep." They offered her food, water, a place to stay. She nodded gratefully, but remained seated for hours, hands resting on her knees, eyes closed. When asked her name, she replied, "I don't think I need one yet." And they accepted that. As the sun rose higher and the wind began to lift grains of dust into the air, someone noticed the reeds beside the stone had begun to lean, not blown by force, but curving together as though listening. No one moved them. They let them bend, let them rest. And the tree too, though old and thirsty, dropped a single fig into the dust, a soft sound, a beginning, or an ending, or both. By the time the rains returned, the fig tree had already begun to green again. The first drops came at night, soft, sparse, almost apologetic. A light tapping on clay roofs, a hush across the fields, as if the sky itself had paused to ask permission. The next day, the river swelled just slightly, and the people said nothing, only moved slower, more deliberately, their hands grateful without needing to say so. In the village beneath the tree, the still place was fuller than ever. Not crowded, not heavy, just quietly abundant. Scrolls now arrived tied with dyed string, or pressed between layers of cloth. Some were no longer written but drawn, circles, waves, hands, stars. The children began organizing them not by subject but by mood, the ones that calmed, the ones that sparked wonder, the ones that needed to be touched before read. One scroll simply read, "I was silent my whole life, but here I leave my voice." Another, "I forgave my father today. I wanted someone to know." And beneath it added in another hand, "I think he knew already." The traveler's resting place, beneath the fig tree, had grown into something more than a grave and less than a shrine. People did not come to pray there. They came to breathe, to sit, to place their backs against the roots that now curved like arms cradling the earth. Children would often fall asleep there, mid-question. No one woke them. The teachers in the village, who now called themselves rememberers, began gathering the children every week not to lecture, but to walk, across fields, to riverbanks, to wine-shaped stones, and at the end of each walk, they would ask the same thing. What did the world ask you today? The answers were never wrong. Why do trees reach instead of fold? Do shadows ever get tired of following? What is the shape of kindness when no one is watching? The questions were recorded and tied with reeds and added to the basket in the still place. But now, a second basket had appeared beside it. Questions we haven't spoken yet. People would sit near it in silence, their hands resting on the rim, as if trying to feel the shape of the question still inside them. Then F never returned again. But word came, years later, from a village in the north, that an old man had died beneath an olive tree with his hands ink-stained, while a scroll unfinished beside him. He had written only one line before the ink stopped. Some journeys begin after the walking ends. The message was sent to the village beneath the fig. They added it to the stone at the center of the still place, not carved, but painted in clay, which they allowed to fade with rain and time, because nothing true needed to last forever. One year, a girl named Sari left the village to walk the old path the traveler had once taken. She carried no map, only a reed pen, a bundle of blank scrolls, and a small pouch of earth from the still place. When asked where she was going, she said, "I want to forget how to be important and remember how to be present." No one tried to stop her. Before she left, she placed a small offering by the fig tree, a mirror, cracked and dulled, wrapped in cloth. Beneath it, a note, so we don't forget that even reflections grow old. Decades passed. The fig tree remained. Its roots buckled the stone beneath it. Its shade stretched across the still place until it became difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. New generations came, and while the name of the traveler was not spoken, his absence was deeply familiar, like the hush before a breath, or the warmth left in a garment after someone has gone. Sometimes children asked who had started the first question, and the elders would smile and answer, "No one," and "everyone," because that in the end was the truth the traveler had carried all along. Not that he was a god, not that he had all the answers, but that he had dared to ask aloud, what if power could listen? What if silence could lead? What if a pharaoh could simply be a man? The rain fell again one evening, long and gentle, and in the village beneath the fig tree, the people let it soak into the roots, the reeds, the stones, the scrolls, knowing that everything they needed had already been planted, and that it would rise again, not in statues or in hymns, but in the next question.